Tonight, Senate Republicans are trying to bully a woman into testifying to the Senate Judiciary Committee on their terms. And the terms the Republicans are offering Professor Christine Blasey Ford are worse. They are worse than the terms that same Senate Judiciary Committee offered to Professor Anita Hill in similar circumstances 27 years ago. And there's no other word for it. I am sorry. There's no other word for what the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, is trying to do to talk to Dr. Ford. It is the Senate's version of bullying. Senate chairmen have bullying powers, and Chuck Grassley is trying to use his. Chuck Grassley is desperately trying to create public rationales for what he is doing that sound reasonable, but they only sound reasonable if you know absolutely nothing about Senate procedure, Senate committee procedure, and the history of Chuck Grassley's own Judiciary Committee, and most importantly, Chuck Grassley's personal history. Most Republican members of the Senate do not understand Senate procedure. In fact, Democrats either. They do not understand Judiciary Committee procedure, not really, and they do not understand Judiciary Committee history. Very few of them do. And only one of them knows Chuck Grassley's personal history with this subject. And that is the 84-year-old Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, who sits beside the 85-year-old Chuck Grassley in the Senate Judiciary Committee now. They are the two Republicans on the committee who have been here before. They are the two Republicans who personally bullied Professor Anita Hill when she came before that same committee to testify against Clarence Thomas's nomination to the Supreme Court by a Republican president because she said he had committed repeated acts of sexual harassment against her in the workplace and elsewhere. They are the only two Republicans still sitting on that committee 27 years later, 27 years after disgracing themselves when Anita Hill testified to the committee. They're still there. Anita Hill's accusations against Clarence Thomas were investigated by the FBI. And at the time, everyone thought that was a reasonable thing to do. It was the only thing to do. And the FBI's investigation only took a couple of days. No one said, we don't have time for an FBI investigation. And no one said that because no one would have believed it back then. It would have been like standing up in the Senate and saying the earth was flat. Everyone in the Senate knows there is no deadline for a committee confirmation vote, and there is no deadline for a confirmation vote by the full Senate. Chuck Grassley is trying now to pretend there is some kind of deadline that does not allow the time for an FBI investigation that we know only takes a couple of days. And the very best witness against Chuck Grassley on this lie is Chuck Grassley.
Now, when the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and when the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee learned of these allegations, the FBI was immediately ordered to conduct an investigation. That investigation was completed before the Senate Judiciary Committee voted on Friday, September the 27th, 1991.
Chuck Grassley. When the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and when the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee learned of Anita Hill's accusations, the FBI was immediately ordered to conduct an investigation. And Chuck Grassley thought that that was exactly the right thing to do back when he was a junior member of the Judiciary Committee. Orrin Hatch was on the Judiciary Committee when Anita Hill testified, and he could not resist poring over the details publicly of the pornography that Anita Hill says Clarence Thomas told her about at work. Senator Hatch gained enough seniority in the Senate to eventually become chairman of the Judiciary Committee before he moved on to become chairman of another committee. And here is what Orrin Hatch said about the FBI investigation of Anita Hill's accusations.
Chairman Biden and the ranking member Thurmond, when they heard about this the first time, they immediately ordered this FBI investigation, which was a very right thing to do. It's the appropriate thing to do. They did what every other chairman and ranking member have done in the past. And the investigation was done, and it was a good investigation.
They immediately ordered this FBI investigation, which was a very right thing to do. That is kind of uniquely Orrin Hatch verbiage, a very right thing to do. It's the appropriate thing to do. They did that. They did what every other chairman and ranking member have done in the past, and what Orrin Hatch said there was true. It was true then. It's true now, but Orrin Hatch won't say it now. Now, when these two old men of the Senate, Orrin Hatch and Chuck Grassley, lie to us now, they lie as if they don't know that the video still exists. They lie as if they have forgotten there is a congressional record of every word they've ever spoken in the committee and on the Senate floor. Chuck Grassley and Orrin Hatch both believed that an FBI investigation that only lasted a few days was the appropriate thing to do in response to Anita Hill's accusations, and now they're saying there is no reason to do that. Before hearing Dr. Ford's testimony, this means that Senator Grassley's invitation to Dr. Ford to testify to the committee is being issued with malice. Chuck Grassley won't even give her what he thought was appropriate for Anita Hill. Before he then abused Anita Hill, he personally did in that hearing. And we saw what they did to Anita Hill. We saw what those Republican senators did to Anita Hill when she came into their hearing room. Dr. Ford says Brett Kavanaugh sexually assaulted her, tried to rape her, she believes. Brett Kavanaugh says that never happened, nothing like it ever happened. One of them, one of those two people, wants the FBI to investigate, and the other one doesn't. Why isn't Brett Kavanaugh demanding an FBI investigation? Why? Why not? Why doesn't Brett Kavanaugh want to submit to the best professional investigators we have? And why does Dr. Ford want to submit to an investigation by the FBI? Why does she want to do that? And why do the Republicans in the Senate want to save Brett Kavanaugh from ever facing an FBI question about this? Every reason that they give is a lie. Every single reason. You just saw Orrin Hatch say it's the appropriate thing to do. You saw Chuck Grassley say that that is exactly what was done when the Judiciary Committee learned about Anita Hill's accusations against Clarence Thomas. The Republicans in the Senate Judiciary Committee and all of the Republicans in the Senate, all of them, every one of them, every single one of them, is now lying about not needing an FBI investigation. That is a lie that every single Republican in the United States Senate has now agreed to tell. Why should Dr. Ford accept worse conditions issued to her with malice for her Senate testimony than what the very same committee gave to Anita Hill? Chuck Grassley is pretending that he has given Dr. Ford options, the option to testify privately, which is not something she has requested, or the option to testify publicly. That's a way of pretending that Dr. Ford has some menu of multiple choice in front of her about how to do this, but the option that she wants is more time, because she and her family have essentially become fugitives trying to avoid the glare of this story and the death threats that come with it. And she wants what Anita Hill got. She wants an FBI investigation. She wants a basic, decent approach to this subject, first by the FBI. Chuck Grassley won't do that. Chuck Grassley says no FBI investigation. And the only possible time on the calendar that exists for this is Monday at 10 a.m. No other time is possible. And in his bullying letter today to Dr. Ford's lawyers, Chuck Grassley demanded something even more impossible to comply with, even more bullying under these circumstances than the Monday 10 a.m. appointment in Washington, 2,500 miles away from her home. In the last line of Chuck Grassley's letter to Dr. Ford's lawyers, Chuck Grassley says, Dr. Ford's prepared testimony and biography are due to the committee by 10 a.m. on Friday, September 21st. If she intends to testify on Monday, Chuck Grassley is demanding Dr. Ford's full written testimony by 10 a.m. on Friday of this week so that he and the committee members can have it all weekend and, of course, start leaking it at 10 a.m. on Friday morning. Chuck Grassley didn't expect to be here. Even when Dr. Ford's accusations first became public, he was sure, absolutely sure, that he was still going to be able to hold a vote on this nomination tomorrow. Chuck Grassley began this week, along with the rest of the Senate Republicans, believing that they were going to have the committee vote on this nomination tomorrow. They believed that they would not have to delay anything, and they were wrong. They were wrong about what was going to happen next. Chuck Grassley now thinks he knows what is going to happen next. But Chuck Grassley has misjudged the strength of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford every step along the way to where we are now. And so we know now how strong and how smart Dr. Ford is in the way she has handled herself this week and dealt with this committee, her very first week of public life in America. But here's what we don't know. How stupid is the American news media? This is one of those times we have to ask that question. And I don't mean Fox News. I mean reporters and media organizations who should know better. How many of them will just stick their microphones out there and let Chuck Grassley get away with any lie he wants to tell about there being no time for an FBI investigation? This is when voters need the news media, because voters cannot drop everything they're doing at work and rush to Washington and occupy the halls of the Russell Senate Office Building or the Dirksen Senate Office Building and tell those senators how they feel. It is the Washington Press Corps now that has a job to do, and it's an important job, and only they can do it. And that job is not to simply facilitate and pass along the outright lies of Chuck Grassley and Orrin Hatch, and now all of the Republican senators who are all lying about the fact that there's no time for an FBI investigation. The news media's job now is to penetrate and expose that lie. That is a lie. And any member of the news media who accepts that lie unchallenged by any Republican member of the Senate is complicit in that lie. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee is on his way to committing a crime against the truth in his committee. And I'm no longer sure that Chuck Grassley even knows that. I'm no longer sure Chuck Grassley has any memory of a single word he said during the Clarence Thomas hearings. I worked with Chuck Grassley when I was on the Democratic staff of the Senate Finance Committee in the 1990s. And on that committee, Chuck Grassley was always a reasonable, if occasionally cantankerous, participant in the committee's work. And he almost always voted against everything I was trying to move through that committee. But I never doubted Chuck Grassley's integrity in his work in the Finance Committee at that time. But I am sorry to say Chuck Grassley has stayed in the Senate way too long. Listen to this. Listen to the very first words that Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, spoke today when he was asked why he opposed an FBI investigation this time.
Just so you guys and gals all understand, maybe I'm not supposed to say guys and gals, maybe I better say men and women.
Yes, Senator Grassley, it's 2018. We call them women now. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.